Welcome everyone to our October Access Now statewide briefing, new polling on voter attitudes toward disability issues. My name is Ted Jackson. I'm the Community Organizing Director at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers and the Disability Organizing Network. The Disability Organizing Network is committed to organizing accessible communities where we live, work, learn, shop, play, and vote, very important in this election year. I'm very proud to present our presenter today, Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi. She's the CEO and President of Respectability in Washington, D.C. Jennifer, as I said, is President of Respectability USA in Washington, D.C., which is a nonprofit organization working to enable people with disabilities to achieve the American dream. In that capacity, Mizrahi has met with the majority of governors, many future presidential candidates, Hollywood celebrities, major employers, philanthropists, and others to expand job and other opportunities for people with disabilities. She also has led numerous national polls and brought significant visibility to the issues of America's 56 million citizens with disabilities. Mizrahi served as founder and president of Laszlo Strategies. She has done projects with the White House, more than 60 U.S. senators, and has helped elect prime ministers and presidents around the world. Mizrahi is an expert in strategic communications, political strategy, and on numerous public policies, including international relations. She has published more than 300 columns and opinion editorials on policy and politics, produced numerous videos, and has been interviewed hundreds of times on national television, including CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and others. A former spokesperson for the Democratic National Committee during the Clinton administration, Mizrahi became post-partisan after 9/11 when she turned her work for a decade to winning hearts and minds on issues of terrorism and Middle East peace. Mizrahi previously was Political and Training Director for Campaigns and Elections magazine, a graduate of Emory. She also successfully completed further work on performance metrics at Harvard. She overcame dyslexia, spent much of her senior year of college in a wheelchair due to a car accident, knows the joys and challenges of parenting a child with disabilities, and is a passionate advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. So welcome, Jennifer.
Well, it's just wonderful to be with you, Ted Jackson, and this terrific group of California activists. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And I've got you on your first slide here, disability issues for voters in the Senate battleground. We can begin whenever you're ready.
Great. Let's go ahead to the first slide. So thank you all for caring about these issues. This is a terrific survey that was just completed by a bipartisan team of pollsters. If you move to the next slide, this is a poll that's very special because there are 12 Senate seats that are pretty much tied or almost tied around the country. So this survey really looks at those 12 swing Senate races, and it takes a look at voters with disabilities and also those who care about those issues, and takes a look at the larger electorate. If we look at the next slide, please, you will see that the majority of voters either have a disability or a family member or a close friend with a disability. So sometimes people with disabilities, they really think that they're really alone or there's very few of us. But you do see that the majority of voters do care about these issues because they're personally touched by this issue through somebody that they love. Looking at the next slide, please. If you look at this issue, sometimes people tend to think that disability only affects older people and that younger voters don't care about these issues. But because of IDEA, you see that schools in the public school arena at least have become more integrated. There's much more inclusion in them. And so younger voters also say that they know people with disabilities and that these are their loved ones. And so this is not just an issue for senior citizens. Next slide. You also see something that many people find very surprising. A lot of people think that all people in the disability community are Democrats, but that's just simply not true. In fact, it's pretty much equal between Democrat, Republican, and Independent. You see that there's really almost no difference, and that means that this is a true swing voter group. And because of that, it's a group that should have way more power, because people that address the issues we care about can really win elections. Next slide. What we do see is that the American voters, who are the likely voters, do not think that the federal government or the state are doing enough to help people with disabilities get jobs. The question is, thinking about the current policies and programs your state government has to help people with disabilities get jobs and become independent, would you say the state government is doing more than enough, not doing enough, or not doing anywhere near enough to help citizens in your state who have disabilities get jobs and become independent? And what you see is that the majority of likely voters do feel that government is failing. Both the federal government is failing and the state government is failing. Next slide, please. What we also see is that they're more likely to fault state and the federal government in terms of some of these issues also, and they're really very disappointed. Next slide. This issue does have electoral consequence. In other words, sometimes people will like something better or they'll like something less, but it will not impact their vote. But if a candidate was to make this a part of their campaign, they do say, the likely voters do say, that this would impact their vote. We asked the question in the poll, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for a candidate for the United States Senate who makes enabling citizens with disabilities to get jobs and become independent a high priority, or would it make no difference to your vote? And what you see is that the majority of voters overall say that it will impact their vote. In fact, for people with disabilities, obviously, it's more so than those without disabilities. But even for those with no disabilities, you see that it goes from 49% it impacts their vote positively and only 5% against. And that's even much more so in the races for governors. They really do want to make this an electoral issue if activists such as yourselves will help these candidates campaign on these issues. Next slide, please. The swing voters in this issue do take this seriously. We ask, would you be more or less likely to vote for a candidate for governor who makes enabling citizens with disabilities get jobs and independent a high priority? Would it make no difference to your vote? Again, as I said in the previous slide when it was broken down, here this is the overall vote, and the swing voters for 61% say it matters. 61%, but look at the intensity level. For 34%, this is very intensely an issue for them, compared to only 4% that say it wouldn't impact them. So from 61 to 4, that's quite a margin. This overwhelmingly can be a voting issue. Next slide. And in the battlegrounds, it is also moving to swing voters among independents, independent women, married women, non-college women, etc., the suburban voters. So this is really across the board with swing voter groups an important issue. Look at slide 17, please. When we take a look at this issue of today, 70% of people with disabilities don't have jobs, and even though most of them would prefer to work, of the following reasons, which do you believe is the most important reason why unemployment is so high amongst people with disabilities? So we gave them a list of possible answers, and these different items were randomized. In other words, the order that they were listed in was different for each person, so it didn't have any sort of order bias in the survey. What we see is that people with disabilities could lose government benefits if they work turned out to be the #1 reason that likely voters, whether they had disabilities or not, thought was a barrier to employment. The second highest was employers are unwilling to hire someone with a disability. This is the stigma that Respectability, our organization, is working on fighting on a regular basis, and I know many of you are doing the same thing. Next slide, please. This just lays out more clearly that question again so you can see the different choices that they were given. Again, these answers were randomized. Slide 19, please. We do see that many people, at least as a hypothetical, claim that they would be open to hiring people with a disability. So we ask, if you were an employer, manager, or small business owner, how willing would you be to hire a qualified person with a disability? Very willing, somewhat willing, not very willing, or not at all willing. And what we see is that 98% of Americans at least claim that they would be willing to be open to hiring a person with a disability who is qualified. Notice we had the word qualified in there. I think the answers would have been very different if we didn't have that word in there. But that means that aspirationally, people do want to think of themselves as being very open to being inclusive employers. We know that their actions don't yet reflect that. If you think about it in this way, sometimes people on New Year's Day, they say, I'd like to lose weight, but then they see the candy and they eat the candy so they don't lose the weight. But at least aspirationally, we see that it is a goal. We also see that they have a commercial goal in terms of inclusion, saying as a customer, how important is it to you that the companies you do business with do not discriminate against qualified people with disabilities? Very important, somewhat important, not very important, or not important at all. What we see is that 89% are saying that it's important, and 61% of them overall are saying it's very important. So this is a really good thing to be bringing to employers, to be bringing to companies and advertisers to say, look, it's good for business for you to be seen as inclusive of hiring people with disabilities. Slide 20, please. We also see that there's bipartisan support for reforming the work asset rules to allow people with disabilities to work. Again, we saw that this asset issue was seen as the #1 barrier to employment for people with disabilities. We asked, under current law, people with disabilities who receive Medicaid and other payments from federal and state governments have a cap limit of $1,070 per month in income and $2,000 in total assets before they lose benefits. Would you favor or oppose changing the law to increase these caps and allow people with disabilities to earn more without risking their benefits? We see overwhelming support for modernization and for reform of these benefit caps. Incidentally, I happen to serve on a commission that is looking at making some changes in these rules, and this is much easier said than done. But this is very much top of mind now because the SSDI Trust Fund is due to have a very serious financial shortfall in 2016. So currently in Washington, the Ways and Means Committee are looking actively at changing some of these rules. So it's a key time for you to be in touch with your elected officials on these issues. Next slide, please. The majority are also much more likely are more likely to support a Senate candidate who supports changing this law. So it's very important to let them know that you care about these issues, but also let them know the majority of voters care about these issues as well. Next slide. There's also support for the Disability Treaty overall, with 65% supporting it, 23% opposing it. Not surprisingly, there is some partisan difference between Democrats who favor the treaty 83-10 and Republicans who favor the treaty 50-32. But no matter what the political party, the majority do actually support the treaty. Next slide, please. So if we go back, there's another set of slides that's about employment that Ted's going to tee up for you, because I do want to share some thinking about the implementation of the WEA Act, the new law that was just passed by overwhelming bipartisan margin in Washington. This new law impacts $17 billion a year in annual spending. Ted, are you pulling up those slides?
Jennifer, I wanted to just stop briefly for a moment here, since we just went through and reviewed the information from the polling that you did, which has some really striking responses, I think, and very interesting, and to see if anyone had any questions on the first part of today's presentation.
Fabulous.
Are there any questions out there? I know I have one. Just to get us started with some questions here. So you talked in the beginning about the swing voters and the indications that the disability community has, even throughout partisanship and independent ideologies, and that shows that they could be swinging and they could also have a lot of political power. What do you think that they need to do? What's the next step to activate that political power that's coming out of this research?
Well, first of all, I think one of the challenges faced by the disability community is that we're far too fragmented. People who are blind say I'm part of the blind community. People who are deaf say I'm part of the deaf community, as opposed to uniting and saying, hey, we're all part of the disability community, because overall we share many of the same concerns. I mean, 70% of Americans with disabilities who are working age are outside of the workforce. People who live on disability benefits are just above the poverty line. People who live on benefits who would like to work are limited from doing so because you might get a job that pays as much as $40,000 a year, for example, and you want to take that job. But if you're a quadriplegic and you need a personal care assistant to help you shower, dress, and get ready to go to work and to have transportation, somebody comes along and takes away the personal care assistant that you needed to get to your job. That's obviously not helpful. So we really need to, first and foremost, unify as a community so that we can take care of each other's interest in the same way. The second thing is that we're in the closet. Much like many people from the LGBTQ community were in the closet 20 years ago. People today, they're very open about homosexuality or being transgender, but in past years, 20 years ago, that was not the case. Well, 20 years ago, this population did not have marriage equality, partially because people were in the closet and they didn't think that they knew somebody who was gay, even though they did. So not being open and disclosing that you have a disability is definitely a barrier, because people don't always realize, hey, not only do I know somebody with a disability and care about somebody with a disability, but look, the majority of people around me care as well. So first of all, we need to unify. Secondly, we need to self-identify publicly. Thirdly, we need to be reaching out to candidates, and that's very important. We need to set high standards, and we need to ask them for position papers. For example, most candidates do not have a position paper on their website about disability issues at all. So one of the things that I urge all of you to do is to write immediately via email to all the candidates and say, hey, where is your position paper on jobs for people with disabilities, or the disability treaty, or whatever issues are really impacting you. That's very important, is to really ask them to be responsive and, of course, to build relationships with them. That is very important as well.
I'm glad that you bring that up, Jennifer, because for a lot of the folks that are on the call right now, and it's interesting that you bring that last point up, is that the Disability Organizing Network has a candidate survey out for the gubernatorial candidates, as well as our constitutional offices and every member of the Senate and Assembly who are candidates and running for office this year. And 5 o'clock today is actually the deadline. So folks after this webinar might want to call their Assembly and Senate candidates and ask them, do you plan on sending in the questionnaire from the Disability Organizing Network today? That would be a great activity that folks could do. And I think also, along with the coming out thing, that is incredibly important. And one of the ways that we could be coming out is turning out on Election Day and making sure people see us and making sure we vote. So are there any questions before we move on? If you want to ask a question from the teleconference line, please unmute your phone by pressing *6. Any questions out there, or from folks on the webinar system? All right, we're going to go ahead and move on here. And the first slide of the second half of our presentation today is up. There you are, Jennifer.
Great. If you go ahead and switch it to the next page, that'd be terrific. So our organization is working with a broad coalition of groups that are supporting employment for people with disabilities. The idea is that everybody who wants to work should be able to work and not only have a job, but have a good job and have the access to promotions and to raises. And so we have to start by taking a look with really clear eyes at the current situation. So in the state of California, if you don't have a disability and you're working age, on average, it's 73% of those people without disabilities are gainfully employed. For people with disabilities, however, only 32% are employed. So this is a massive gap between 73% being employed and 32% being employed. In my state of Maryland, for example, about 40-something% are employed. So California is really not in good shape, considering that a lot of people have given lip service to these issues over many years. We've seen 0% improvement in terms of employment outcomes for people with disabilities in California since the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, which is almost 25 years ago. Today in California, you have almost 1,800,000 people who are working age and who have a disability. And additionally, you have 115,000 people who are people with disabilities ages 16 to 20. This is an incredibly important number because you have to take a look at that. That age cohort from 16 to 20, that's 4 years in span. So take that number and divide it by 4, and you'll get the approximate number of people with disabilities who are coming out of school and into the workforce each year. So the question is, how do you ensure that 115,000 divided by 4, that there's that many transition from school to work programs or opportunities, and that there's jobs for these individuals? This is your core, most important group of people, because people who are coming out of school, that transition to work is so very important. In California, you have 400,000 people who are receiving benefits because they have disabilities and who are working age, costing the government billions of dollars. The VOC rehab still in California, despite these very, very large numbers of individuals, only succeeded in gaining 11,000 jobs for people with disabilities in California in 2012. Obviously, this is not the outcome that we would like to see. We'd like to see some dramatic changes. We did a webinar earlier this week on how to go about that using the statistics from Mathematica, which is a world-class organization doing performance metrics on employment. And what we saw is that there's 2 times when it's really, really successful for getting people with disabilities into the workforce and in good positions. One is when they're coming out of school. And then secondly, if they have previous job experience and they have a newly acquired disability. So maintaining the supports and having the supports that are really preemptively helping people get into jobs before they get trapped into the benefit system is very, very important. If we can look at the next slide.
And just really quickly, Jennifer, there is a picture of Governor Jerry Brown on this slide, and all of these slides do have the Respectability logo on them.
Yes, they do. Thank you. I apologize that that was not noted for people who have vision differences. This one also has a chart, but the chart that is there has the straight numbers. It's the prevalence of disability amongst non-institutionalized people aged 16 to 20 in California in 2012. Now, I mention this number again because these are the talent streams that are coming through your schools and that are going to be ready to work soon. And so we need to be thinking about them, and we need to be thinking about what kinds of disabilities they have, and we should also look at what kinds of employment outcomes they have. But for example, you have 23,000 young people with visual disabilities, you have 13,000 with hearing disabilities, and you have 76,000 who have cognitive disabilities, which can be a combination of an intellectual disability or a mental health disability. These are very, very large numbers, and the capacity of the programs that California is offering, both through the government or nonprofit organizations for transition from school to work, nowhere near meet the needs of these cohorts. Next slide, please. What you see here, next slide. Oh, sorry, that was the slide of age 21 to 64, how many there are in each different disability category. And this is important because, for example, if you have a visual or a hearing disability today, assisted technology can be a fabulous aid to you, and there's no reason for you not to have the same sort of employment outcomes as an individual without a disability, for example. And also we've seen very good outcomes for people with cognitive disabilities through the Project Search program and some other innovative programs for transition from school to work. Next slide, please. Here overall in California are the expected employment outcomes for people with disabilities in California. And you see, again, 32% are employed, but you see there is tremendous variance by what kind of disability you have. So that if you have a hearing disability, over 46% are in the workforce, and more so also for a visual disability. But if you have an independent living or a self-care disability, your outcomes can be as low as 14 to 16%. Cognitive disabilities, it's way down at 20%. That means that 8 out of 10 people with a cognitive disability who are working age in California are not in the workforce. Many of those individuals are on benefits that if you start on disabilities when you're a young person, over your lifetime will cost the government more than $380,000, not including the Medicare, Medicaid benefits. So clearly investing in transition from school to work programs can cause dramatic cost savings for the government. We're talking major, major savings for the government that can be achieved. At the same time, obviously, it's a much better outcome for the individual if they are gainfully employed and can be independent in the community. Next slide, please, Ted. Now, Governor Brown's office has been doing a lot of things to really become model employers. They have a new executive order that they're issuing, and I see we have the date wrong in terms of for the ADA thing. I mean, it shows that they're going to be celebrating it on in 2015, but they are in the process. Let's move to the next page. There are a number of Project Search sites that are in California. I mention Project Search because what's important about Project Search is that it gives people real-world experience. If you have an intellectual disability and you're not going to be achieving a high school diploma but a certificate of completion and you're age 19, you can stay in the classroom and you might achieve a little more academically. But if instead you want real work experience, this is a far better way for you to go, because you can get, instead of going to school during the school day, you go to an actual work site where you spend about an hour in the classroom learning job skills, but the rest of the day you're actually doing a job. So over the course of a school year, they do 3 different internships and get real life experience. The reason that this is so important is that the outcomes for these individuals are over 60, and in some states 70, and in other states 80%. So what you see in California is that across the entire state, people with intellectual disabilities are only achieving a 20% employment rate. However, graduates of Project Search who have the identical characteristics as those who have the only 20% success rate are achieving higher than 70%. So the more of these young people that we can put into these programs before they finish school or around the time they're finishing school, the more you can ensure that people can have independent living opportunities. This is not the only kind of program. There are other programs done by Bridges, by Marriott. There are programs done by other organizations. For example, the Promise Grant is a really successful program. But what we see is that with investments from the government, we can achieve far, far higher inclusive competitive employment rates for people with disabilities in all states, but that California is way behind. Next slide, please. There's a new rule that has come out from the federal government that is very exciting. That rule is 503. 503 says that federal contractors must hire 7% of their employees or have 7% of their employees be people with disabilities. It also needs to be in all job categories. This is incredibly important because if you're Lockheed Martin or IBM or another large employer of people with disabilities, it's not acceptable to simply have 7% of your workforce overall be people with disabilities if they're all in the mailroom or all working as janitors. You need to have 7% across the board. So if you have engineers, you need 7% to be people with disabilities. If you're a hospital and you have doctors, 7% should be people with disabilities. If you want to know in California who are the companies who are federal contractors and therefore have this new obligation that begins on January 1 of 2015, go to this website that's on page 8 here, because this is a wonderful website that lists in detail who are all the California companies that now have this new obligation to be inclusive of employees with disabilities. Many of these companies won't know how to do it. There are many resources. One of them is AskJan.org, but I'm sure that you're a great resource as well. So be sure that these employers know that they can get help and that it's not so difficult to be an inclusive employer. In fact, many of them think wrongly that the accommodations will be very expensive. But what we have seen and what many have seen is that these are very inexpensive overall. Sometimes as little as $50, sometimes free. Next slide. This just shows you where we got some of the data from. If we can go to the next slide. We have a lot of resources on our website for policymakers, including a lot of data about California. So you can always email me and ask me any questions that you have, or you can look on our website. But I'm open to questions, and Ted Jackson, I want to thank you again for hosting me today.
It was our pleasure to have you on today, Jennifer, and this is a lot of information, and it's really, really good information. So I want to open the floor to questions right now. Is anyone there in the audience, does anyone have any questions, especially on unemployment or the connection with education and transition?
Hi, Ted. This is Mike Levinson.
Hi, Mike. Go ahead with your question.
I have two questions, but I want to ask one first because it's probably just not being on the webinar, I couldn't tell. You presented a slide about, from the employer's perspective, why people with disabilities were not hired earlier.
So that was actually the reason, it asked the reason people were not employed, but it was not saying from the employer's perspective,
okay.
It could have been from any perspective.
Great, then that's more likely to generate my answer. Where was transportation and ability to get, to and from the job on that?
So Ted, can you scroll back to that slide? Because it was actually quite low, and it was surprisingly low.
Because I used to work in San Francisco. I live very close to San Francisco, and our company moved out to the East Bay for all the jobs related to my skills. I ended up getting into a van pool, which was fine, and the company assisted with that as well. But I just don't know, I would have, had that not existed, either had to move or change jobs. And I just don't know how people.
So Jennifer, could you tell me what?
It was giving us. It was in the
Okay.
green slides from the Greenberg PowerPoint, and it was towards the end of those slides. But it was actually one of the options that people were given, and it was not rated as a top reason because people really felt that overall this issue of the benefits reform was a bigger issue, and additionally they thought that the stigma against people with disabilities, the fact that employers didn't want to hire them, was a bigger issue. And so those ranked higher. Ted is moving the slides around.
I don't agree. I don't disagree. I'm sorry. I don't disagree that those are more important reasons. I just want to know where transportation is.
And Jennifer?
Yeah, towards the bottom.
Jennifer, did you have a slide number on that by any chance?
I don't, and I can't move the slide.
I think it was in the first, say, 10
it was
or 12.
in the front. You know, he's pretty close here to where they are. If you just turn them around, that's it, right here. So transportation was only 7%. So it ranked people with disabilities could lose government benefits if they work. This is slide 17. Then employers are unwilling to hire someone with a disability was 20. And then employers are worried about lawsuits if they hire someone with a disability was 3rd. And then health or medical issues was 4th at 12. And then transportation was 7. And then people cannot do the job. People with disabilities cannot do the job as well as those without disabilities was 6. And then people with disabilities have not tried hard enough was 4. And none of the above was 3.
And then my second question may not be exactly where your survey or polling goes, but do you delve deeper into why people with disabilities might not be as effective once they are hired? And this goes back to education, and you mentioned schooling and different training programs. I was mainstreamed, and I have a sight disability. In other words, I wasn't put in any special classes, and I also grew up a long time ago. And now I know that has changed dramatically, where there's assistance for everything in different areas of school. And I don't know if your research covers how that has benefited or harmed people coming out of school with disabilities. Because
so this is an excellent question. It's not in the data that I presented today, but we did a different.
Let me say the one connection, and then I'm finished.
Mm-hmm.
Because my feeling is if an employer has a bias, it's that somebody coming from a special school or from a special program or coming off an injury or whatever it is might not have the experience of coming from an environment where they're fitting in already. That's where I see the prejudice coming in from employers.
No, this is a really good question. So let me answer it in a couple of ways. First of all, we did a separate survey not so long ago of people with disabilities, their family members, and their providers. And there were 3,800 people in that sample, and it was a very large survey on employment issues. And what we found is that younger people with disabilities themselves feel much more ready for the workforce, much more confident about their skills, and that they do feel that the IDEA with the inclusion in the mainstream classroom has been a really big advancement. But one of the big problems, obviously, is that most people with disabilities are not in the workforce at all. So it's not that they're living down employers, it's that they're not even given the opportunity with the employers. And it starts when you're very young. In other words, for a person without a disability, frequently when they're in high school, they're starting to work at Starbucks or McDonald's or mowing lawns or as a camp counselor, and they're getting that early work experience. So what we see from employers that they want to hire somebody who worked before. If a person with a disability waits to start looking for their first job opportunity until they're finishing high school or college or even our PhD, then they're really at a very significant disadvantage. And so the most important predictor of future employment for people with disabilities is previous employment, which is why it's so important to start with internships when people are very young and in high school. These internship opportunities, these summer job opportunities, even volunteer opportunities are extremely important. And in fact, for people who have sort of been sitting on a couch with benefits for many years, it is vital if they want to get back into the workforce for them to find a volunteer opportunity where they can build up their credentials and their confidence before they try and apply for jobs, because unless you can put previous work experience on your resume, most employers will not touch them. And that goes for people without disabilities as well. I've seen quite a number of studies that show that employers will not hire people without disabilities if they don't have previous recent work experience.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
This is Bob Plantold. I'd like to ask a question or offer an opinion.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I'm in San Francisco, and regarding employment, some months ago, our city council had a hearing about employing people with disabilities. It lasted a couple of hours. Different city agencies talked. What I noticed was very often the city agencies talked about opportunities at the very lowest beginning administrative or support level.
Yes.
And they were not talking about professional career track civil service jobs. Sure, people with disabilities can get law degrees, can get accounting degrees, but sometimes in a city government or county government, you work your way up through a civil service position to be a planner, to be some researcher, to be, and I got to say, even in this great uber liberal city council members do not hire people with disabilities to work in their district offices, to work at City Hall, and we do not get appointed to key commissions like the Planning Commission, for example. And I wondered what, if anything, you folks may have observed, both Ms. Mizrahi or Ted, about how to break through the, yeah, we'll let you in the bottom door rung, and it pretty much keeps people with disabilities at a not only low rung, low paying, but boring job where you're sometimes just handling the mail, filing, sending out form letters, and not anything that stimulates your brain or gives you training for handling anything other than mundane pieces of paper.
So I have quite a lot of information on that, and so I'll try and be brief despite the fact that I have huge passion about this
issue. And Jennifer, you have time.
Just
so you know, you have time.
This is such an important question, and I'm really very passionate about this issue because people think, oh, a person with a disability, they can bag groceries, that's it. Yeah. And that's so not true. I mean, that might be a great job for some people with disabilities, but for most people with disabilities, it's not. Interestingly, there are many knowledge worker companies that have discovered that they have a fair number of employees on the autism spectrum. How do they know? They never self-disclose. But they discover because they are covered by their company's health insurance policy, and their health insurance policies are covering large numbers of prescriptions for things like Risperidone and other medications that people on the autism spectrum may take, and that they're getting the autism diagnosis through their, their health insurance. So they see these very large number of people on the spectrum that are working in the Silicon Valley. That's why I mentioned, this particular thing is the Silicon Valley has a lot of people on the spectrum, and in fact, what we've seen is the New York Times Sunday Magazine did a whole feature story on the autism advantage, how the people who are on the spectrum frequently have more attention to detail, and they're less distracted by the sort of social things that might go on by the water cooler or the Starbucks that's by the office. They're very focused on detail, very focused on achieving goals. And so what we see is that these workers can be far better in many cases than their people who are their peers without disabilities. So we do have this problem, but also we have a problem that sometimes you have magnet programs at schools that are for particular specialties. I'll give you an example. I live in Maryland, and in my county, the magnet program for kids in STEM, there's a STEM magnet program. It's in certain high schools, and a requirement to get into the magnet high school for STEM, again, science, math, technology, is that you have to have taken foreign language in middle school. Why is this a problem? Because for all kids with disabilities who get resourced when they're in middle school, that's a little extra time and help when they're doing their homework. It might help them with organizational skills, or they're doing their speech therapy, or they're doing their physical therapy, or their occupational therapy, or whatever it is that there's extra thing, they're always taking them out of foreign language. So the kids with disabilities almost never take foreign language, and yet to go into the STEM magnet program, foreign language is a requirement. So we have to be sure that we're looking to make sure that our school policies are in line with our goals. Now all of a sudden I'm in touch with IBM. IBM is headquartered in New York. IBM is in the knowledge worker business, just like many in San Francisco are in the knowledge business. They say they have a shortage of workers that are coming out of schools who are ready for these STEM jobs at IBM without disabilities. Forget about disabilities. They have enough, they're having problems filling these jobs with people, and this is one of the reasons they've been pushing for foreigners to be able to come in, because they don't see enough Americans with these skills. And now along comes this new regulation, 503, and says, hey, you need to have 7% of your people in all job categories be people with disabilities. And they say, look, I don't find enough people without disabilities to fill this job. Never mind candidates who are qualified and ready with disabilities. How am I going to find it? And so that's why it's important that people who are active in these issues and who care like you do, that you're in touch with your governor and with your school boards and make sure these issues are addressed so that people can be very, very qualified. Now, as to somebody who is already qualified and they're working in government, then they really need to be a little bit noisy sometimes and ask for it. There was just a very interesting set of news stories, I don't know if you saw it, but Microsoft had a leader, I guess their CEO, made a very inappropriate comment saying that women should not be asking for raises if management is just going to figure it out on their own. And he had to very publicly, apologize today for this really ridiculous statement. So, women should be asking to be paid equally, and this is one of the biggest campaign issues that Democrats are bringing forward today as candidates, is that women equal pay for equal work. This Ledbetter Act, and they're all rallying around equal pay for equal work. Well, you know what? People with disabilities should have equal pay for equal work, and they should also have the opportunity for advancement, promotions, and raises as well.
And Jennifer, since Bob had tagged both of us at the beginning of this, I kind of wanted to chime in here as well.
Yes, please do.
Not quite as long and an in-depth answer with so many wonderful facts, but just a little bit from experience, Bob, and I'll go back to when I was doing ballot initiatives in the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered, and doing organizing in that community. And we spent a lot of time, we weren't thinking about disability as much. We did a little bit on the No on Prop 8 campaign, and of course in the last few years my eyes and mind and heart have been opened up in a different way. But we were trying to be as inclusive as possible, and what it really came down to was we had to be intentional. If we were running a campaign, I ran a campaign in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we had all of these great applicants for some field organizer positions, but we needed women and we needed people of color. And we had to stop and say, okay, right now we're getting applicants that are white and that are male. And we already have a white male field director, myself, so there's something that we're not doing in outreach. And so we're going to hold the position open. We're going to recruit more volunteers to do the tasks of that position, or two positions actually it was, and we're going to do some more outreach and be intentional about the fact that we want to hire a person of color and a woman for this particular job. And I found that that has always been true. If you say that you're going to do it and you go forth and do it. A lot of times in the Disability Organizing Network, when we do events, one of the things that I will do is I'll work with Dolores Tejada, because she's so good at this, from Community Resources for Independent Living. But she and I will sit down and look at the broad spectrum of how many presenters on webinars have we had that were of a diversity. How many have been disabled? How many have been women? How many have been people of color? How many are in our speakers at our summits? And we do diversity checks on ourselves. And I think that we have to get folks to a place, whether they're in government or the private sector, public or private, to a place where they are intentional about being more inclusive. That was a really great question, Bob.
I cannot help but to comment on this issue, because I so agree with you about how even within the disability community, we are not diverse enough. I go to meetings and I find that self-advocates who are the CEOs of most of the disability organizations, it's almost all white males. And I was at a meeting, there were dozens of CEOs of disability organizations. I was the only woman there, and everyone else was male, and everyone was white. And this really struck me, and currently I'm serving on a national commission looking at benefit reform on the Social Security Disability Insurance Benefit Trust Fund. We have about 24 people on this commission, and not one of them is non-white. Every single person is Caucasian. And I said, no Hispanics, no African Americans. So it's really painful to see, because we do have to be sure that while we're saying nothing about us without us, for people with disabilities, we have to be sure that we reflect the broader disability community.
And to answer your question, Bob, I really think, what I was sharing my experience about was that we have to use the same type of techniques when it comes to disability in the way that the independent living centers have. They actually have a mandate that says, 51% of board and staff have to be people with disabilities. And we just need to get that somewhere out into the public and private sectors, and I don't know that we're going to be able to mandate it like that in the private sector. It's more of a cultural change.
Right.
And it just needs, we need to find elected officials, but also find small business owners and large business owners who are willing to make that commitment to say, you know what, let's get some assistive technology in this office so that we can hire people with disabilities. Or there's this great person, they have a disability, and educating them, well, you know what, you still can hire them because maybe they can do more on a iPad, which is their AT, their assistive technology, than on a computer that would cost you more money. Are there any other questions?
I'm glad I sparked this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you.
Good conversation. Are there any more questions out there?
How do you respond? How do you respond?
To which piece?
To the one we were just listening to.
To it not being diverse enough. I mean, I have several times gone to people and suggested other people be nominated for committees. Every single time I'm in a working group and there aren't people that are included, I go and search for who are qualified people who are of color or who are Hispanic or whatever. I mean, you need to have more diversity. The more diversity of ideas you have, the better off you're going to be. Unfortunately, I myself don't always have the authority or the power with which to choose who's on a various commission. I mean, I know myself, I'll just speak for myself, that right now the White House through the Department of Labor is seeking applicants to be nominated to serve on a particular board that will help advise on the implementation of this new WEA Act. This is something that I work on, like almost every waking hour. I'm working on the implementation of trying to create more jobs for people with disabilities. I'm really passionate about it. I went over to speak to someone at the Labor Department. They said they have over 400 people had been nominated as of about 10 days ago, and the deadline is not until Tuesday. They're only going to take 12 people. So how do I get myself on that commission? Now, I do not know if at the end of the day I'll be one of the 12 people that are chosen, but I can tell you that I myself personally have asked at least 10 people to nominate me. Because I did not want to risk that I'm a new person in the field. They don't know me as well as people who've been around for a long time, and they have 400 applications. I've been working on this issue, and I obsess about this issue. I feel I have energy and ideas. So how do I get on this commission? I actually am strategizing. Who are the people that might know the Secretary of Labor, who's a particular decider, who are people that have credibility in the field. So literally, Governor Markell, who wrote the Better Bottom Line initiative on employment for people with disabilities, he nominated me. Congressman Brad Sherman from California nominated me. Congressman Pete Sessions, who's a Republican, chairman of the Rules Committee, he nominated me. And the heads of multiple national disability groups that represent people, particularly with developmental disabilities, such as the DD Councils and Best Buddies, have nominated me. So, I'm not taking it for risk. And I'm somebody who's been in Washington working in politics for 25 years, and I'm not going to chance it. This is something really important, I feel, and so I'm actively campaigning for it. And I think that if you are a person who's stuck in a job working for city council and they're not giving you the interesting work, that you can't just, sit back and take it. I think that when you decide that you have something to contribute, you need to sometimes campaign for yourself, advocate for yourself by proving what your skills are, and saying what is it that you have to contribute. So each of these reference letters, it's not just I'm writing to nominate Jennifer, but it has, bullet by bullet or point by point what it is that they think I can offer to the task. And I think that each of us with a disability has to learn how to sell ourselves, and sometimes it feels a little awkward because we're supposed to somehow be a little more humble. Sometimes people treat us with pity, and you can sometimes get sucked into having almost pity for yourself. But you can't just have pity and say, oh, well, that's the way it is. You have to really make a strategy, make a plan. I always say, plan your work and work your plan. What's the goal that you want to achieve, and step by step, what do you need to do to get that done? What's the timeline? What are the resources that you need?
Jennifer, this is Mike Levinson. I just wanted to clarify one point on what you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. I tend to be completely open and down to the nth detail, about what my disability is and what I can do and what I can't do. And obviously there's a huge spectrum, in terms of openness and in terms of privacy and everything else. But is there a way you can just go into advising people for certain types of situations what the best approach is, as opposed to, say, getting hired and then creating a bad atmosphere because something the employer didn't know comes up, and then the atmosphere turns negative, as opposed to disclosing everything and then not getting hired potentially?
Look, my feeling is that when you're dealing with an employer or a boss or the head of a commission that you want to be in, the most important thing you can do is you can ask the individual, what does success look like to you? What is the perfect job candidate for this? What are they going to do for you? What are they going to achieve for this organization? And what does spectacular look and feel like to you? And then to think through what you can do to help achieve that. And if there's some things you can do, you say, well, I can really be a superstar in this, but I'm going to need somebody else to do that. Like, for example, I've been working for politics, as you know, for more than 25 years. I stink at math. I am dyslexic. I cannot tell the difference between the number 18 and the number 81 in a consistent basis. I just cannot. I cannot. So everything that I do with numbers, I need PowerPoint slides that shows me bar graphs or pie charts, and then I just memorize the numbers from there. But if you put them on a spreadsheet, on an Excel sheet, I can't even hardly dial a telephone number by myself. It's so bad. And so I'm very open with people to say, hey, you know, if somebody needs to write down a bunch of numbers in a row, maybe somebody else can do that for me. Can somebody else, you know, make a PowerPoint for me? Because that really is not my core strength. But there are other things that I bring to the table. Here's what I bring to the table. So I think the conversation starts best by how can I help you?
I use a screen reader because of my sight disability. No, that's interesting though, because I use a screen reader to read electronic, you know, computers and other things because of my sight disability.
Right.
And it was just kind of interesting because that's how I read numbers sometimes too, when the screen reader can't pronounce something clearly. And so screen readers are not dyslexic, obviously. They just read what's there from an electronic translator. And so it's just an interesting thing because one of the things I would always put on an application would be I work better in teams, you know,
right,
as opposed to by myself, just what you
right,
were saying a minute ago. And so
right,
that happened when I, you know, got hired at this one computer programming job, is that, you know, they didn't just stick me off in the corner and say, do this, do this, do this, and come back next week and let me know, you know, whether you're done or not. You know, we always had, you know, 2, 3, 4 people working on something in my office.
Right. And for everybody who helps look over your shoulder, figure out something that they need someone to look over their shoulder, you know, to help them. Even if it's not a physical look, but, you know, figure out what you can do to help them.
Yeah, oh, I had plenty of things. Yeah, it was a good outcome.
Right.
All right, are there any more questions?
Are there any other questions?
Would anyone on the teleconference line like to ask a question? You can unmute your phone by pressing *6. All right, folks, I'm going to remind you that you can check us out on the web through our interactive website, disabilityorganizing.net. Don't forget that a lot of the stuff that Jennifer has talked about today really activates through our elected officials, and we do have an election coming up. There are resources for this election on the website at disabilityorganizing.net/voting. You can also check us out on Facebook at donetwork.org. That is our name on Facebook. And our Twitter account. Our handle on Twitter is donetwork.org. There's no dot between work and org, just at donetwork.org. And I also want to remind folks that today's training will be recorded, captioned, and archived. And it'll be up on our website in 7 to 10 business days at disabilityorganizing.net. Click on Trainings and Events, and at the tab at the top, click on the Training Archive Library. We will also post this on our Election Center page on the Disability Organizing website. And finally, we want to get better at the work that we're doing through these webinars. So thank you for participating today, and we would appreciate it if you would share your experience with us by completing the survey that will pop up. Your feedback is highly valued. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone else.
Thank you so much for hosting me, and it was a delight to be with you all, and I wish you all much success in everything that you do.